The bar was called the Canteen, which was either ironic or honest, depending on how long you had been stationed at Fort Bragg. It sat at the end of a commercial strip 2 miles off post, a low brick building with a parking lot full of pickup trucks and a Budweiser sign in the window with one letter burned out so long that nobody remembered what it had originally said. The floor was scuffed hardwood. The bar itself was a long dark wood counter that had been through 20 years of glasses and elbows, and the kind of conversations that only happen when people are far enough from authority to say what they actually mean. The pool table in the back was regulation size and well maintained because this was the kind of bar where the pool table mattered. 3 televisions showed a football game that nobody was watching closely because the score had been a blowout since the second quarter. She walked in at 9:15 on a Thursday night. She was wearing jeans, a plain grey fitted shirt, and boots that had seen more miles than anyone in the building would guess from looking at them. Hair down and loose. Nothing military about the way she looked, except that she moved through the door with the specific efficiency of someone who always knows exactly how wide a door frame is before they reach it. Not pausing, not scanning obviously, just walking in with the knowledge already in her body. She found a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the main cluster, back to the corner, sightline covering the room and both exits. She sat down. She ordered bourbon, neat. She did not look around the way people look around when they are hoping to be noticed. She looked at the bar top. She looked at her drink when it came. She sat with the specific quietness of someone who has been very loud in places most people in this room would never go. The bar was doing its Thursday business. A group of 8 soldiers near the pool table, junior NCOs, E5s and E6s, wearing the particular confidence of men who had done their first deployment and returned, believing they understood what there was to understand. They were young and loud and not unkind exactly, but they were aware of their own presence in the room, the way young men with fresh combat experience tend to be aware of it. One of them noticed her about 20 minutes after she sat down. His name was Sergeant Danny Webb. He was 24. He had been to Djibouti and come back. He had good shoulders and the absolute certainty of someone who had never been the least experienced person in a room. He said something to the man beside him, and that man looked at her and grinned. Webb picked up his beer and walked over. He said, "Hey, sweetheart, you look a little lost." She looked at him. Her expression did not change in the way expressions change when someone is deciding whether to engage. It simply held, calm, complete, unmoved. The face of someone who has been assessed in conditions that would genuinely unsettle Danny Webb, and has never once required the person doing the assessing to think well of her. She said, "I'm not lost," he said. "This isn't really a civilian bar. There's a place down the road that's more of a..." She said, "I'm fine here." He said, "You got someone on post?" She said, "No." He said, "Then what are you doing here? This is kind of a soldier's place." She picked up her bourbon. She took a sip. She set it back down with a small, precise click that was quieter than the noise around it and somehow more present. She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. He was trying to read her, and she was giving him nothing to read, which was a thing that some people found reassuring and most people found unsettling. He went back to his group and said something that made them laugh. She heard the word sweetheart again. She did not react. She ordered a second bourbon and looked at the bar top and thought about something that had nothing to do with Danny Webb. At 10 o'clock, he came back. He said, "You're still here." She said, "I am." He said, "Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk, but people want to unwind and you're just sitting there. It's a vibe thing." She said, "I'm not affecting anyone's vibe." He said, "You're making people uncomfortable." She said, "Which people?" He looked around and could not find a specific face to point to. She said, "Go back to your game, Sergeant." His jaw tightened slightly. He said, "How do you know my rank?" She said, "The way you stand." He went back. The man 2 stools down from her said, without looking away from the television, "They do that to everyone who comes in alone." She said, "I know." He said, "Most people leave." She said, "I know." He said, "What branch?" She looked at him. He was mid-40s, built the specific way that comes from decades of real physical work rather than gym work, the kind of build that does not photograph well because the camera cannot capture the quality of it. Plain black t-shirt, forearms that told a story without words. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time in places where stillness was professional. He said, "The way you're sitting, the way you watched the door when you came in, the way your right hand moved when Webb walked up the second time." She said, "Army." He nodded. He said, "Special Forces, retired, 22 years. "What about you?" She said, "Army." He waited. She didn't add to it. He nodded again, the nod of someone who understands that not adding to it is itself an answer. He said, "Long rotation." She said, 8 months. He said, "Back how long?" She said, 11 days. He said, "Takes about a month before you stop counting exits automatically." She said, "I know." He said, "You're still doing it." She said, "Yes." They sat in the silence that is comfortable between 2 people who have both spent extended time in places where talking was a liability. The bar moved around them, the jukebox, the pool table, Webb's group getting louder on their 3rd round, and none of it touched them. He said, "Briggs, retired Sergeant Major." She said, "Voss." He said, "Just Voss." She said, "Just Voss." He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, an acknowledgement between people who have both done something that the other people in the room have not done. She raised hers. They drank. At 10:30, Webb came back a 3rd time. He had been building toward it. She had seen him look over twice in the last 20 minutes, working up the social justification. He arrived with his arms slightly spread, occupying more physical space than the conversation required, the posture of a man who has decided he is being generous by coming back a 3rd time. He said, "Look, sweetheart, it's getting late, but I'm sure you've got somewhere to be." She said, "I don't." He said, "Well," she said, "is there something you need, Sergeant?" He blinked. The specific blink of someone who has been asked a precise question and doesn't have a precise answer. He said, "I just think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." She said, "You're telling me where I'd be comfortable." He said, "I'm trying to be." She said, "You're trying to be helpful." "I understand. I'm fine up. I'm going to sit here and finish my drink, and then I'm going to decide whether to have another one. And none of that is going to affect your evening unless you keep coming over here." He stared at her. His jaw was doing something. She picked up her glass and looked at the bar top, which was clearly the end of the conversation. He went back. Briggs said, "That's going to bother him." She said, "I know." He said, "Does it bother you?" She said, "Webb?" He said, "The whole thing. Coming in here, having someone tell you to go home, sitting through it." She thought about this honestly. She said, "The part where he thinks he's doing me a favor is the part I find most interesting." Briggs said, "Because," She said, because I've been in rooms where someone underestimating me was the mission-critical variable. You learn to be comfortable with it. Briggs looked at her carefully. He said, "What kind of rooms?" She said, "You don't have that clearance." He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay." She had 9 years in, and she had never explained herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. She had grown up in eastern Montana, where the winters were long and the distances between things were large, and the useful skills were patience and the capacity to stay oriented when there was nothing around you that had a name or a direction. She had enlisted at 18. She had passed Ranger assessment at 20, which surprised the cadre, who logged it carefully and did not say much in the moment and talked about it afterward in the specific way people talk about things they witnessed that they would not have believed described to them in advance. 4 deployments before she was 25. Afghanistan twice. The second time in a unit that was not officially operating in the province they were operating in, doing work that had no official classification, because acknowledging the classification would acknowledge the work. Syria once, under a cover designation that was 3 layers removed from her actual function. A 4th deployment to a country she was not cleared to name in any context. The Special Missions Unit had recruited her 3 years ago, which was itself a thing that did not happen the way people imagined it happened. There was no formal invitation, no ceremony. Just a man in a plain office who said, "We have been watching your file for 2 years." And she had said, "I know," and he had looked at her for a moment and then smiled. The work she did now did not have a name that existed in unclassified language. Her personnel file said Logistics Coordinator. Her actual designation was 2 words on a classified communications architecture that lived in a tier of the special operations community that most people with active clearances would never have the clearance to access. She had not told Danny Webb any of this because he did not have the clearance, and because it was not relevant, and because she had spent 9 years learning that the people who needed to know already knew, and the people who didn't need to know were going to find out eventually in the specific way they were going to find out, which was not through her saying anything. She sat at the bar in her plain shirt. She was not lost. She was never lost. At 11 o'clock, the pool game ended. Webb's group celebrated loudly. The jukebox ran through its rotation and started another song. At 11:15, Marcus the bartender reached behind the bar and adjusted the radio dial by habit. He had been doing it for 11 years. He kept it tuned to a military frequency, useful for knowing when large formations were moving, whether he needed to stay open late. Usually it was the ordinary traffic of a base doing its ordinary business, white noise behind the conversation and the music. At 11:17, the frequency changed, not with a crackle or a burst of static. It simply shifted. The ordinary traffic going momentarily quiet, and something else coming through on a different register, cleaner, sharper, carrying the compressed authority of a communications architecture that was not accessible through a standard radio dial, which meant that what was coming through it should not have been audible in a bar off post on a Thursday night. The voice was clipped and precise. The voice of someone who had spent years making certain that every transmitted word carried exactly the information it was designed to carry and nothing additional. The voice said 2 words, Viper 1. The bar did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, the way a room goes quiet when something occurs that everyone present recognizes as outside the normal register of the evening, even if they cannot articulate why. The people closest to the bar first, then the pool table, then the jukebox corner. Briggs set his glass on the bar. He did it very carefully, as if he needed his hands free. He had been in a classified briefing 3 years ago that he had not been formally invited to, and had accessed through a logistics corridor that left a door open. He had heard Viper 1 in that briefing, in a context that told him exactly what tier of operation it referenced. He had never repeated it. He looked at her. She had not moved. She was looking at her glass, but her jaw had changed, the very specific tightening of someone who has received information that requires a decision and is making it. Marcus said, "That's a weird frequency for..." Briggs said, "Turn it up." Marcus turned it up. The voice said, "Viper 1, your transport is in the lot. You are needed at Bragg Command. Authorization level 7. This is not a request." The pool table had gone completely silent. Webb was standing with the cue in his hand and his beer halfway to his mouth. The jukebox had hit the pause between songs, and nobody moved to put in a quarter. The entire bar seemed to compress slightly, every person in it becoming aware simultaneously that they were in the presence of something operating at a frequency they could not fully read. She put 2 20s on the bar. She stood up. She picked up the plain jacket from the back of the stool and shrugged it on. And as she did, the inside collar was briefly visible. A small patch, black on black, a unit insignia that did not appear in any public record or unclassified document. The kind of thing that is designed to be invisible to anyone who does not already know what it means. Briggs saw it. His face did something that faces do when they encounter information they expected, but hoped was wrong. She said to Marcus, "Keep the change." She walked toward the door. Webb said, "Wait." She stopped. She turned. The bar was completely silent. The jukebox had not started its next song. He said, "What's Viper 1? She said, "You don't have that clearance." He said, "Are you active military?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What unit?" She said, "You don't have that clearance either." Briggs stood up from his stool. When he stood, something in the quality of the room adjusted. The way a room adjusts when someone with a specific kind of weight gets to their feet. He said, not loudly, "What's your tier?" She looked at him. Something passed between them. The quiet recognition of 2 people who know the same language, and one of them has just confirmed which tier of it they're operating in. She said, 1, JSOC, Special Missions. Briggs said very quietly, like a man who was finishing a sentence he had started in his head the moment he heard the call sign, God. She buttoned her jacket. She said, "Have a good night." She walked out. Through the bar window, the parking lot was lit by the headlights of 2 black vehicles that had arrived without anyone hearing them pull in. This was a thing that should not have been possible. The lot was gravel, and every soldier in the building had been paying ambient attention to their environment all night as a matter of professional habit. And yet, the vehicles were simply there. Low profile, dark, engines running without sound or vibration visible from the window. In the specific way that certain things are there when they are operated by people who do not wish to be heard arriving. She crossed the lot without hurrying. A door opened from the inside. She got in. The vehicles moved out of the lot without any sound that reached the bar's windows. Just 2 sets of red tail lights shrinking on the road and then gone. Webb stood at the bar window. He was holding a pool cue. He did not remember picking it up or walking to the window. He looked at the empty road. He looked at Briggs, who had sat back down at the bar and was looking at his glass with the expression of a man closing something in his head. Webb said, "Who is she?" Briggs said, "I don't know her name." Webb said, "But you know what she is." Briggs picked up his glass. He said, "Tier 1, JSOC, Special Missions Unit. Authorization Level 7, transport at 11:17 on a Thursday night from an off-post bar. She's been on a rotation. She's probably still operational in a sense that's different from what we mean when we use that word." He set his glass down. He looked at Webb. He said, "She is the reason soldiers like you get to come home." The pool cue in Webb's hand felt suddenly like a very different object than it had been 10 minutes ago. He set it on the table. He looked at the men around him. Nobody said anything. Marcus was behind the bar, looking at the door, and then at the radio, as if he was trying to understand what his radio had just done. Webb said, "I told her to go home." Briggs said, "Yes." Webb said, 3 times. Briggs said, "Yes." Webb said, "She didn't go." Briggs said, "No." The jukebox had not started its next song. Nobody had put a quarter in. The bar was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet between songs. A listening quiet, a working something out quiet. Webb said, "God." Briggs said, "Yeah." She walked back into the canteen the following Friday at 9:15. Marcus saw her and nodded. He put 2 fingers on the bar without speaking. She sat down. He poured bourbon neat. The bar was fuller on Friday. More people, the jukebox running louder, the pool table already in rotation. She sat at the far end in her usual spot and looked at the bar top and felt the particular quality of returning to a place that had seen something of you and had not changed around it. At 9:30, Webb walked in with 2 of his men. He stopped when he saw her. 3 full seconds in the doorway. Then he walked across the bar. He said, "You came back." She said, "I told you I was fine here." He stood for a moment. He looked at the bar top. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "I called you sweetheart. I told you to go home 3 times. I didn't." She said, "You didn't know." "That's different from being wrong." He said, "I was wrong too." She said, "Yes." He said, "What you are." What those 2 words mean, I tried to look it up. With the clearance I have, which isn't much, but I understand enough to know that I was in a room with someone who... He stopped. He was having trouble finishing the sentence because what he was trying to say required him to span a distance between his understanding of the world and the actual world that was larger than he had previously believed it was. And spanning that distance in a sentence was not simple. He said, "I was condescending." She said, "You were. And now you know something you didn't know before. That's the job, Sergeant. You start not knowing things. You learn them." He said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "Go shoot your pool game." He looked at her for 1 more second. The look of someone whose mental model of something has been rebuilt in a week and who is still testing the new architecture of it. Then he nodded. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He went to the pool table. Briggs came in at 10. He sat 2 stools down. Same spot. He ordered as usual and looked at the television and said, without looking at her, "You came back." She said, "The bourbon is good." He said, "How was the trip?" She said, "What trip?" He said, "The level 7 transport that pulled you out Thursday." She said, "I can't." He said, "I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if it went well." She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He picked up his glass. The bar moved around them. Comfortable, ordinary, doing its Friday business that did not know or need to know what had happened in it 48 hours ago. He said, You know what I noticed Thursday? She said, what? He said, when Webb came over the third time and you shut it down, you weren't annoyed. You weren't performing patience. You were actually just sitting there being patient. That's a different thing. That's a thing you learn somewhere very specific, she said, or a very long time. He said, usually both. She said, yes. Usually both. He said, 22 years for me. I still have mornings where I have to remember how to have a morning. She said, how do you do it? He said, same thing every day. Coffee, run, sit still for 20 minutes. The 20 minutes is the hard part. She said, because there's no objective. He said, because there's no objective, no measure of success, no timeline. Just time, passing, and you in it. She said, I'm working on it. He said, you came back 2 nights in a row. That's the objective for now. She said, that's simple? He said, that's simple. Show up. Stay. That's the whole skill. She looked at her glass. She said, I'm very good at staying. He said, I know. I watched you do it Thursday. What she had not told Briggs, what she would not tell him, because the clearance didn't exist for it outside the secure facility where it was authorized, was what the Level 7 transport had taken her to. The briefing had been in a building that did not appear on the public directory of Fort Bragg installations, accessed through a gate that required biometrics in addition to credentials, staffed by people with the particular alertness of those who work hours. The rest of the base does not. Colonel Whitaker had briefed her in 12 minutes. An asset in Bogotá, active for the first time in 4 months. A regional network that the intelligence community had been unable to penetrate through other means. The asset would only meet with a female contact at Tier 1 clearance who had prior experience with the network's operational architecture. She was the only person active in the unit who fit the profile. She had said, I know the network. He had said, I know you do. Know you. You identified 3 of their current logistics nodes on your last rotation. She had said, what's the window? She had left for Bogotá on a military flight to Miami and a commercial connection to El Dorado that landed at 1400 local time. She was traveling as a Canadian logistics consultant named Sarah Merritt, which was a cover with documentation deep enough to survive the thorough customs check it received. The city smelled like exhaust and rain and old stone and new concrete. She had spent the first day building the map, walking the neighborhood around the asset's last known contact point, in the way of a tourist making slightly wrong turns, noting cover positions and surveillance angles, and the 7-minute gap in the network's rotation on 15th Avenue that she had confirmed from satellite data and verified on foot at 6:15 in the morning. On the second day, she had made contact. The asset was a woman named Maria, 34 years old, 2 years inside a network where the average asset survival time was 6 months. She was alive because she was precise and patient in the way that very few people are patient. Not waiting exactly, but occupying time with the full attention of someone who understands that time is the resource that is always running out and the one thing you can spend correctly. They had met in a coffee shop. Maria had said, "You're younger than I thought." She had said, "You're still alive, which is all that matters." Maria had passed her a small notebook. She had put it in her jacket pocket without opening it. She had told Maria to change her route home. Go back on 15th Avenue. Stop at the pharmacy on the corner for 8 minutes, because the network's surveillance rotation had a 7-minute gap, and she needed Maria through it before it closed. Maria had said, "How do you know that?" she had said. I walked it yesterday. The notebook contained the names and coordinates of 3 regional network nodes that intelligence had been seeking for 14 months. It contained the command structure above the previously known level. It contained operational schedules that would allow the planning cell at Prague to build targeting packages within the week. She had carried it out of Bogotá in the lining of her jacket and transferred it to the intelligence chain in Miami and flown back to Prague and debriefed and been given 72 hours and eaten a sandwich standing over her kitchen counter and run 7 miles on the post trail in the afternoon heat and felt herself slowly returning, the way she always returned, in increments rather than all at once. And at 9:15 on a Friday night, she had walked back into the canteen because the bourbon was decent and Briggs would be there at 10, and Webb had looked at her on Thursday with the specific look of someone whose world had been rearranged, and she wanted to see what he did with it. What Webb did with it was he started coming in on Thursdays again, not to talk to her. She hadn't invited conversation, and he was smart enough to understand that. He came in, saw she was there, nodded, and went to the pool table. He played his game. He did not tell her to go home. He did not call her anything. After 2 Thursdays, he came to the bar to order drinks and stopped 2 stools down from her and said, without ceremony, "I've been trying to understand what I don't understand. About your work, about what that tear means." She said, "And?" He said, "I understand that I can't understand it. Not because I'm not capable. Because I don't have the context." She said, "That's exactly right." He said, "I was in Djibouti. That's not nothing." She said, "No, it's not nothing." He said, "But it's not." She said, "No." He said, "How do you get there? To where you are?" She said, "You don't aim for it. You do the work that's in front of you. You do it right. You do it again. After long enough, the work changes because you've changed." He said, "That's it?" She said, "And you never leave a position because someone tells you to." He looked at her. He said, "Is that a joke?" She said, "A little." He almost smiled. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He went back to the pool table. By the 3rd Thursday, the canteen had a different quality when she walked in. Not quieter, not louder. Something more specific. The quality of a room that knows it contains a different kind of person and has decided to simply let that be true without making a production of it. Marcus poured her bourbon when she sat down. Briggs was at his stool. Webb's pool game ran in the back, and he nodded when she came in. The bar did its business. The jukebox played. The television showed whatever game was on, and she sat at the far end of the bar with her bourbon and the solid wood counter and the ambient noise of a room full of soldiers doing their Thursday night. And she was quiet in the way she was always quiet in places that did not require her to be anything other than what she was, which was a thing that happened less often than it should, and that she was learning to find rather than waiting for. She had 11 deployments in 9 years. She had operated in 7 countries, in 3 continents, in 2 of which she did not officially exist as a military presence. She had done things in the dark that the daylight wouldn't be improved by knowing about. She had come home from all of it and found that home was a thing that required active construction, that you did not return to it automatically, that you had to build it out of small specific things, like a bar stool and a glass of decent bourbon and a retired sergeant major 2 stools down who understood without needing to be told. She was building it, slowly, precisely, in the same way she did everything. Briggs said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You can ask." He said, when it comes back, the easy part, the civilian part, sitting in a bar without running contingencies. When does that come back? She said, I don't know. It hasn't fully come back from the first deployment. He said, that was 9 years ago. She said, yes. He said, and you're still here. She said, I'm still here. He said, building it back one Thursday at a time. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I spent about a year after I retired being angry about it. The difficulty of it. The fact that it was hard to do something that should have been easy. She said, what changed? He said, I stopped measuring it against what it should be and started measuring it against what it was the week before. She said, and, he said, each week it was a little less, not gone, less. That's the whole game. She said, a little less each week. He said, a little less each week. She picked up a glass. The jukebox was playing something slow and honest. The pool game clicked in the back. Outside, the Fort Bragg night was warm and pine-scented and indifferent and real. She said, I can work with that. He said, I thought you might be able to. On the 5th Thursday, Webb came to the bar at 10:30. He sat down one stool away from her, not at the bar for a drink order, not passing through. He sat down. He put his elbows on the bar. He looked at the row of bottles behind Marcus, and then looked at his hands, and then said, I've been thinking about what you said. She said, which part? He said, the part about never leaving a position because someone tells you to. She said, yes. He said, I've been thinking about the deployments I have ahead of me, and what I want them to amount to. She said, and, he said, I want to be better than I was Thursday 3 weeks ago, not better than I was in Djibouti, better than I was in this bar, telling you to go home. She looked at him. He was 24 and he was sitting at a bar at 10:30 on a Thursday, and he was talking about something real. That was worth something. She had sat across from officers twice his age who could not do that. She said, that's a good place to start, Sergeant. He said, yes, ma'am. He went back to the pool table. He was different in the way that young people are different when something has genuinely changed in their understanding of the world. Not loudly different, not performing the change, just walking back across the bar with a slightly different center of gravity. Briggs, who had heard all of it, said, you're good at that. She said, at what? He said, saying the exact thing and no more. She said, 9 years of practice. He said, yeah. She did not sleep easily on the nights after she had been home for a while, not the nights after she came back. Those were the nights she slept heavily from accumulated exhaustion. But the nights a few weeks in, when the body had rested and the mind began doing the work it had been too tired to do before. She would lie in the dark in her quarters at Fort Bragg, and the room would be very still, and she would hear the ordinary sounds of a military base at night. Distant vehicles, the occasional aircraft on a training circuit, the particular quality of a post settling into its quiet hours, and she would be somewhere else simultaneously in the way that certain kinds of experience live in the body alongside the present. She had learned not to fight this. The people who fought it made it worse. She had learned to let it coexist, to be in her bed at Fort Bragg and also in the places she had been, until gradually, over the course of a night, the places she had been released her back into the present, and she would wake at dawn with her hands flat on the mattress and the room bright and ordinary around her. She ran in the mornings. She ate. She went to the planning cell when she was in the rotation, and she sat with her clearance level, and she did the work that the work required. She went to the range once a week. which was not required, but which was the activity that most reliably made her feel fully present. The way that some people feel fully present in a garden or a kitchen. She was building a life around the edges of the work, building it the way you build anything that has to last. Carefully, with attention to the foundation, without hurrying past the parts that aren't there yet. The canteen was part of that building, a small part, but specific, a place she had chosen, a stool she had sat in, a bartender who poured without asking, a retired sergeant major 2 stools down who understood the language without requiring it to be spoken. She was staying. She had always been very good at staying. She had been asked once, in a psychological assessment 3 years ago during the Special Missions Unit recruitment process, what she would do if an operation required her to be somewhere that was genuinely dangerous, and she had no communications and no extraction and no backup. She had said, "The same thing I'd do if I had all of those things." The evaluator had said, "What's that?" She had said, "The work." He had written something down. He had said, "You don't find that frightening." She had said, "I find it clarifying." He had said, "What does it clarify?" She had said, "Everything that's not the work becomes irrelevant." That's actually easier in a way. He had looked at her for a long time. He had said, most people, when everything else is stripped away, find they don't know who they are. She had said, "I know who I am." He had said, "Who are you?" She had said, "I'm the person who stays." He had closed his notebook. He had said, "Yes, we think so too." The unit had called her call sign for the first time 3 days later. Viper 1. 2 words on a classified communications architecture that had been chosen by people who read files for a living, and had decided that the particular quality she brought to work in rooms where most people would not survive made her worth a designation in the most restricted channel. She had heard it, and she had said nothing, and she had gone to work. That was 3 years ago. She was still going. Every Thursday at 9:15, a woman in jeans and a plain shirt and worn boots walked into the canteen and sat at the far end of the bar. She ordered bourbon, neat. She looked at the bar top. She was quiet. The bar did not make a production of her being there. The jukebox played. The pool game ran. Marcus poured. Briggs sat 2 stools down. Webb nodded from the pool table. She had become, in the specific way that things become true in a room over time, a fact of the place. Not famous, not recognized, just present in the way that certain people become present in a place they have chosen. Not because the place chose them back, but because they kept showing up until the showing up was simply part of what the place was. She did not need the room to know what she had done. She did not need the room to know what she was. She had come in on a Thursday night and been told to go home, and she had stayed. And then a radio had said 2 words, and every man in the room had understood something. They had not understood 45 minutes before, and she had put 2 20s on the bar and walked out to a transport that should not have been audible in the gravel lot, and had not been. And then she had come back. Because the bourbon was good, because Briggs would be there at 10, because she was building something out of Thursday nights and bar stools and decent bourbon, and she was not going to stop building it because someone told her to. On the 6th Thursday, she walked in, and the bar was louder than usual. A group she didn't recognize, probably TDY soldiers from another post, filling the middle section with the noise of people who don't know a place yet and are trying it on. She walked to the far end. She sat down. Marcus poured without asking. One of the TDY soldiers noticed her and said something to the man beside him. They looked over. One of them got up and walked toward the bar. He was young. He looked at her and said, "Hey, you come here a lot?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You military?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What branch?" She said, "Army." He said, "What unit?" She said, "That's restricted." He said, smiling in a way that was meant to be charming, "Come on. What are you, like a clerk or something?" From the pool table, without looking up from his shot, Danny Webb said, "Son." The TDY soldier looked over. Webb sank the shot. He straightened up. He looked across the bar at the young soldier and said, quietly and clearly, and in a tone that did not invite response, "You don't have that clearance." The soldier looked at Webb. He looked at the woman at the bar. He looked at Briggs, who was sitting 2 stools down and looking at the television with the expression of a man who has seen this exact moment before and knows how it ends. The soldier went back to his group. She picked up her glass. She took a sip. She set it down with the small, precise click of someone who has been exactly here before and is exactly here again and is going to be exactly here for exactly as long as she intends to be. The jukebox played. The pool balls clicked. The bar did its Thursday business. She stayed. She always stayed. And if you have ever wondered what it looks like, what it actually looks like when someone has spent 9 years doing work that most people will never know about in places that will never be named, and comes home and sits at a bar in jeans and a plain shirt and orders bourbon, neat, and does not look around the room, hoping to be noticed. Now you know. It looks like that. It looks like the far end of the bar. It looks like the specific quiet of someone who has nothing to prove. It looks like 220s on the bar top and a jacket buttoned and a parking lot full of silence where there should have been gravel under tires. It looks like staying. Hit the like button if this story reached something in you. Subscribe. We put out a new one every week, and every one of them is about a person you walk past without knowing. We'll keep making them as long as you keep watching. She is still there. She will be there next Thursday, and the Thursday after that.